Thank you very much, Joe, for the introduction, and good evening to all of you. I got back to Denver yesterday, and it's a real pleasure to be in Colorado again, my favorite place in the world. So glad to be here, and this is a wonderful spot and beautiful view of the metropolitan area down there. I'm going to talk a little bit about Africa. It's a big subject. It's a big continent, and there's a lot of variations within the continent. Quite often, when I've talked about Africa, I've tended to say, well, I'm really talking about sub-Saharan Africa because the north, the largely Arab but not entirely Arabic north, is really tied more to the Middle East by history and culture and religion. But that's not entirely true because there have been a lot of north-south interactions as well between the Arab world and the African world. And those interactions go on today and are still important. Still, my focus will be on sub-Saharan Africa rather than North Africa, but I'll be happy to discuss events in North Africa and how they may affect the rest of the continent. There's something called it used to be called the Organization of African Unity, an organization of all the sovereign independent states of Africa. Today it's called the African Union. And that's kind of an interesting change of name, and what it reflects is a growing sort of revitalization of this desire for African unity, Pan-Africanism as it's called. And we will discuss what's the basis for this Pan-Africanism. It certainly is not, as Americans might think, racial. It is certainly not religious, because Africa has many diverse religions, including traditional ones, although it's primarily split between Christianity and Islam. It's not based on a single or common culture, because there are different cultural impulses. So what leads to this desire for African unity, and why is it becoming increasingly important? And is it a good thing and a positive thing? And is it a likely thing that will happen as the years go forward? I'll talk about that a little bit as well. I want to start, though, with a story that I have enjoyed. It's the story of Liberia, because Liberia, in some sense, illustrates the ties between the United States and Africa, and these ties go way back. Probably, a couple of hundred years ago, Americans, perhaps many of them like yourselves, concerned about their country, might have gathered on evenings like this to discuss a common solution to a problem that they felt America had to deal with. And that was the problem of race in America, and what would America do with these millions of descendants of Africans who were in this country. And the people who gathered to deal with this problem represented really diverse, maybe even opposite points of view. You had in that group abolitionists who wanted to end slavery. It was immoral, and they wanted to see it ended. You also had slave owners who certainly didn't want to end slavery. They thought it was important to their economic future and would even justify it in terms of biblical references. And you had some slave owners who may have felt, well, I'm not prepared quite yet to free my slaves, but as a bequest, when I leave this world, I will set them free. And all of these people had one common concern. What was America going to do with all these freed or potentially free black people in its midst? They shared one point of view, which was that these people would never be integrated into white American society, that white Americans would not accept them, and therefore they would be a source, if you were a slave owner, of potential trouble and revolt, an example to those who remained slaves. And even if you were an abolitionist, you would say, well, this wouldn't be right. These people need to go where they can be free and enjoy the full benefits of freedom. And so they came up with the idea that, well, we'll start an African colonization movement. And it's a long story, but at the end of the day, in about 1821 or 1822, some African Americans set off from the United States, included a few whites among them, and landed in a part of West Africa that before long became the country known as Liberia. Liberia for liberty. Its capital city was and still is Monrovia, named after an American president, James Monroe. Its flag, a blue field with a single white star and red stripes, would remind any of you of the American flag. I've flown it at my house on Humboldt Street in Denver, and people go by and don't even realize that I'm flying a flag other than the American flag. And in 1847, these people declared themselves an independent republic, the first African republic, although there were empires like Ethiopia. And in their Declaration of Independence, they said, we, formerly inhabitants of the United States of America, have come here to find freedom and liberty because we were denied it in our own country. Now, fortunately, as I stand here today and speak to you, all of you, that vision and that concern shared by some African Americans who left to found Liberia, by some white Americans, either those who opposed slavery or those who supported it, that there would never be integration in this country. I'm happy to say that vision proved to be incorrect, and that the values and strengths of the American vision of rights for all people have, in the end, prevailed. Still, it tells us that there are these special ties between Africa and America, and that Africans have shaped American history. The slave trade in the United States shaped American history, the Civil War in the United States, the Civil Rights Movement. All of those things have been terribly important in this country. And of course, been cultural contributions of African Americans to this society, and there continue to be. It also illustrates something else, two other things I want to mention. The first is that the people who went there were descendants of slaves taken from Africa. They were no longer Africans. They were Americans. That's the first lesson. Second, they thought that race was important because that was what defined them in the United States. And I think sometimes Americans look on Africa and have that same feeling. I've been asked in the past here in Denver in the 90s and during some African civil wars. And sometimes I'm asked that by African Americans. Well, why is there all this black-on-black violence? Would we ask Germans and French and British and Russians why there's all this white-on-white violence in Europe? For Africans, black is simply the way most people are. It is not something that defines you or who you are. You are defined by many things: your village, your ethnicity or tribe, where you live, what language you speak, what religion you have, by all of those things, but very seldom, with some exceptions, like South Africa, where Europeans settled, very seldom are you going to be defined primarily by your color, just as Europeans don't define one another in that way. So it's important as Americans to keep that in mind. It's an important difference between the African point of view and maybe the American point of view. The other thing that I will mention and then move on is that the founding of Liberia, and by the way, the founding of Liberia was preceded by a decade or more by the founding of a place right next door called Sierra Leone. And the capital of Sierra Leone is called Freetown. And by the way, if you look on the maps, as you look on the curve of Africa on the west coast as it curves, you will see Liberia and Sierra Leone, just before the curve sort of heads east. And they're both very small countries. Sierra Leone was founded by the British as a way to colonize Africa by freed blacks in their society that they felt would not be at home in Europe. And they called their capital city Freetown. Now, Sierra Leone did not become an independent country because the British later decided they wanted African colonies until about 1961, whereas Liberia became an independent country in 1847. But the story of Sierra Leone and Liberia illustrates some important things. If you look at that map, it shows some 55 countries that make up the African continent, including North Africa. Most of these countries are artificial creations. They did not grow by conquest, by language, by other things that united people. They tend to represent colonial empires, where the British could get colonies and where the French could get colonies, and in lesser numbers where the Germans and the Portuguese and the Spanish got colonies. As they left and as colonization, African colonization came to an end in the mid-20th century, new countries were founded, not particularly on any other grounds than that one had been British and another had been French, for example. If you look at, it's probably a little hard to see on the map, but if you look at Senegal on the map, and that's also on the curve, but just a little bit, Mauritania is shown up north in a big white block on the left side of the map, and right below that in green you'll see Senegal. And right in the middle of Senegal is a tiny little strip, sort of purple, and it's got the word Banjul in it, and then sort of sitting in the Atlantic Ocean is the name the Gambia. Now, what's the difference between Senegal and the Gambia? Why this little country right in the middle of Senegal? It's because the British wanted a trading station there, and so they took that little piece of land. And so when the British left, the French had the rest of the country, which they call Senegal. Senegal became one country, and the Gambia became another country. Ethnically, the people are the same. They speak the same language, except their official language in Senegal is French, and the official language in the Gambia is English. So you've got that kind of mix-up. That's one legacy of colonialism. I'm not one of those who believes that colonialism is to blame for the problems of Africa. We might ask ourselves, why is this continent the poorest, least developed continent in the world? It hadn't always been that way. Places, for example, like Ghana, at the time of independence in 1958, it had a GDP per capita not much below that of Portugal, and certainly better than that of South Korea. It's fallen way behind. What happened? Is there something inherent in the African character that caused these problems and that led eventually to the wars and all the terrible things that we all heard about, to the famine and the starving children and the diseases? Africans worry about that too. I certainly have. When African independence sort of hit its stride in the mid-20th century, and by that I mean when the scramble for Africa, which European powers undertook in the late 19th century, came to an end after the Second World War, there was tremendous hope, tremendous expectation that things would turn around. Those expectations were disappointed. And they were disappointed for many reasons. Partly because the trappings of power, the ability to obtain riches through government, the struggle for control of governments, and these governments were all highly centralized because they followed the pattern that the colonial masters had left behind. They basically had highly centralized governments. They had relatively few soldiers because they used the old divide and conquer. They used one ethnicity in Africa against the other, against the other, against the other to keep them under control. And that is how the British, with 2,000 men could control a country like Nigeria, which in those days may have had 50 million people. Having stoked that flame of ethnicity and rivalry and then left, many African leaders strive to gain control of the center, because if you control the central government, you control access to everything. And everything meant wealth. You also had the combination of an ideologically driven belief that socialism, especially so-called scientific socialism, was the path to go. Why? To some extent because the people who rebelled against colonialism tended to be the ones who were nonconformists, who were looking for change. And one of the best places to find change, certainly in the early 20th century, was looking at the model of the socialists, whether in Europe, in Russia, or elsewhere, in China. And those became the examples that African countries decided to follow, very often to their economic dismay. Another issue was the Cold War itself. After the end of the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union became, of course, rivals, worldwide rivals, and to a lesser extent, China got involved. British and French had their interest as well. The Cold War meant an ideological sort of struggle to the death. It was a question of who's on our side and who's on their side, and how do we maintain our side and make sure that the Russians don't turn countries communist as part of their program of worldwide domination. I'm sure the Soviets had the same kind of feeling about the Americans. And the result was that we, Americans and Russians and Chinese and British and French, supported and defended leaders and systems that were harmful to the development of these countries, because the aid went to the people that were on our side, and we didn't really care what they did with it, as long as they stayed on our side. It set a very bad example for African countries, and one that persisted even after the end of the Cold War. With the end of the Cold War, however, other developments occurred that led, in many cases, to tremendous civil strife and wars, and in some cases genocide in some African countries. Why did that happen? Because the powers that be had elsewhere to look. The Russians were no longer interested. They were out of the game. When the Cold War ended, the United States, I recall when the Liberian Civil War began in 1990, basically said, we don't have any national interest in this part of the world. There's nothing terribly important here, so why would we risk American lives? But what had happened is you'd had long-term leaders that had been supported by one bloc or the other bloc and had gained power in their hands, and that had stifled dissent and often had played the ethnic cards one way or the other and maintained ethnic differences. And as those people began to die out, or in some cases were overthrown, countries fell apart. These were artificial countries. One group went after the other, and every sort of indication of national unity, which had been very superficial to begin with, disappeared. Liberia, I'll go back to Liberia, in 1980 had been one of the wealthier countries in Africa in terms of per capita GDP. It was still a country that very much divided between a small group of wealthy people, a larger but still small middle class, and a large group of poor people. But still it had a GDP approaching $1,000 per head in 1980, and had been considered by the United Nations, the World Bank, and all the international institutions as having left the ranks of developed countries and joined the ranks of what they call the middle income countries, those countries that were just on the path to full development. By 1990, its economy had declined 76%. And the Civil War began that year, and the economy declined a further 76% until Liberia became one of the poorest countries in the world. These countries were that fragile. Not all of them, but most of them, many of them. Now, I have said I'm going to talk about emerging Africa, and I am the optimists. And I think probably many Americans, if they think about Africa at all, think it's a lost cause. We'll do what we can. Let's see if we can save some children or provide some food. But what we hear about are wars and famine and Rwanda, genocide, and terrible things going on, persistent poverty, and is there anything we can do? And certainly I wouldn't blame people who said, at the end of the day, there's not that much we can do. We can give humanitarian aid, but not much more than that. But slowly and surely, growing out of this this era of conflicts, which really began in the 1980s but accelerated in the 1990s, African countries are turning around. There are exceptions. Let's talk about some of the exceptions. Somalia is a mess, remains a mess today. Oddly, Somalia is one of the few countries that sort of ethnically all one people. They're all Somalis. They're divided into different clans, which just shows that no matter what, human beings will find ways to divide themselves and fight one another. And Africans are no different than any other human beings. Somalia is still a mess. Sudan has had problems and has recently split. There are now two countries, the north, which is largely Arabic, and the south, which is largely African and black African, I should say. There's tremendous tension going on between those two countries, and it's still open as to what may happen. Rwanda has settled down, but I'm not sure anybody would say it's all over, though they've made tremendous progress under their current leadership. One of the largest countries in Africa and one of the richest, the Democratic Republic of Congo, sits right in the heart there of Africa and stretches from the west coast almost to the east, certainly as far as that goes. And that country remains, it recently had an election. The incumbent won. It's not clear whether it was a fair election. There certainly were questions. It remains a divided country and a place where terrible atrocities still continue to go on. In some of the countries that have done better, there are worrying signs. In Nigeria, some of you may have heard, over Christmas, on Christmas Eve, a church was bombed and people were shot and killed. A reflection of tensions between the largely Islamic north, the largely Christian south. So in Nigeria, you not only have ethnic difficulties, you have a growing religious concern. And by the way, in terms of religion, there's a very strong Islamic movement in Africa, throughout most of Africa, more in the north, less in the south. But there's also very strong evangelical Christianity, a very conservative Christianity that recently there's been a big uproar because the British Prime Minister, later followed by our Secretary of State, admonished African countries that they should do more for gays and treat gays more equally, or they might risk British or American assistance in the future. And, African leaders couldn't wait to rush to the microphones to say, keep your aid, we don't want it, it's contrary to our traditions. We are going to pass laws banning homosexual marriage. Not that there's been any outcry for homosexual marriage in Africa, but gay marriage. So it's in many ways a very conservative Christian community in that part of the world. Where do we draw the line? In some of the countries a little bit to the north, which are largely Islamic, had been spared the sort of terrorist influence that had been felt in the Middle East and other places. Some of that is beginning to change in countries like Chad and even Mali and so forth. We're beginning to see some of that. We don't know yet what the influence of the changes in North Africa may have on predominantly Islamic countries to the south. So there are those difficulties and concerns. Liberia and Sierra Leone have gone through decades of civil conflict, and while they are now at peace, have had democratic elections, You still have a UN presence. Peace is still being maintained by United Nations troops in Liberia, and only recently have they been withdrawn from Sierra Leone. So there is all of that concern. Nevertheless, what has changed, and what has changed for the better throughout most of the continent? Well, number one, I think I will start with, not in order of importance, but since we've talked about it, the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War brought about some immediate bad things that we've discussed, including some civil strife and so forth. But it has also brought about a degree of democracy. It is in its early stages, but it actually is beginning to work. It has its flaws. Very often people vote more on ethnic grounds than any other. And that may happen in our country, but not nearly so much. I like to tell people that Barack Obama, had he been brought up by his father in Kenya rather than his mother and grandparents in the United States, probably would not have been elected president of Kenya, because although his father was a Luo, one of the largest tribes in Kenya, I don't know that the Kikuyus would, which is another even larger tribe, would have been happy with having a Luo elected president of their country. But Barack Obama can be president of the United States, and that actually is a great example for African countries as to the direction they might want to go. It's a lesson I like to tell Africans about American tolerance, given the history of race relations in this country. Democracy grows in Africa, and that's a good thing, because at the end of the day, it breeds demands for accountability. And accountability means that all the things you hear, bad governments, I sometimes look around in relatively wealthy African countries, oil-producing countries, and say, do these leaders care about their people? I mean, why aren't there things and slides and things for the children? Why aren't there parks? Why aren't there sidewalks? Why aren't there good clinics? Where's the money going? How could Nigeria be one of the largest producers of oil in the world and have among the highest levels of poverty in West Africa, when the country has many billionaires? When will those leaders be called to account? Well, I think it's beginning to happen, because democracy breeds that requirement for accountability. And I see that happening. Democracy also breeds a need for tolerance and compromise. In Ghana, in 2008, there was an election. The incumbent was prevented he was term limited. He'd served 2 terms. But his party nominated someone else to run, and they were quite confident they were going to win. The opposition party, which had 8 years previously been in power, nominated someone else, a person who had lost twice, and he was running for the 3rd time. The election involved, I think, about 9 million voters. The outcome was decided by 40,000 votes. The opposition party won the election, and the party of the incumbent simply turned over to them peacefully. They didn't even ask for the usual recount or go to the Supreme Court or any other stuff. That probably would have happened in this country with that kind of margin of victory. It was very important because it said that those who lost made a decision. We know what happened in our neighboring countries when they fell apart. And it is more important to us that our country should remain peaceful and develop. And we will come back in 4 years and run again and try to win in that way. That's a very, very important development in Africa. It's in Ghana, but I think it's being and will be repeated in other countries. Something else has happened. The African Union has taken the position that it will not recognize any government that comes to power by force, by military coup d'etat, or by other unconstitutional means. We simply won't deal with you. And in a few instances when that has happened, they have forced change. In Guinea, when the president died, and he was an autocrat, not much of a Democrat anyway, but his prime minister or whoever took over according to the Constitution, and then the military seized power, as they typically done. And the African countries basically said, No, we won't tolerate this. We will not recognize you. We will not let you sit among us. And eventually, they turned over to a transitional government, had free elections, and Guinea is now ruled by a democratically elected president. That's an important lesson. It's coming from Africa. It's not coming from Western countries. It's coming from African countries speaking to one another. And I'm very encouraged by that as well. Something else, going away from the politicians, health standards are improving. People are not going to be very demanding of their government or very productive at their work if they're ill all the time. It's a very long way to go. There are major problems throughout Africa in terms of health, but they're getting better. The economists talked about, and this may not seem so great, that at one time, I think it was out of every 100,000 children, 160 or 168 would not reach a second birthday or something like that. And in the last decade, that's been reduced to 118, still far too much, but it's moving in the right direction. Schools are opening up. The standards are terrible. They're not like the Asian kids yet, but the children really want to learn. And education is being spread, and then educated people are not so readily going to accept what they may have accepted in the past, and they're going to work better. They're looking for jobs. There's the growth of a middle class. It's small but growing. Many African countries today, you can go and there's at least one or two malls that wouldn't be all that out of place in Lakewood or somewhere else here in Colorado. And there'll be an Apple shop in there selling Apple goods. And, reports are that there are 60 million households on the continent of Africa with an annual income of $3,000 or more. Now, by American standards, that's paltry. The continent of Africa has nearly 1 billion people, but 60 million of those households, not individuals, have that kind of income. That's a middle class. That's the start of a middle class. We expect that by 2015, in the next 2 or 3 years, it'll be up to 100 million households. That makes a big difference. Those people are buying things, they're demanding things, they're getting jobs, they're seeing that their children are educated, they're demanding better health care, universities, and so forth. That's an encouraging thing as well. The wars that happened in the 90s, in a sense, were cleansing. We always think in terms of wars because they're so terrible, because innocent people die, that we must stop them. But sometimes, at the end, and I'm not sure it's ever worth it, but sometimes something good comes out of it. And what Africans have learned from the wars that they went through is that we don't want to do this again. And we want to make sure that this doesn't happen again. African countries came to the aid of Liberia and Sierra Leone. There were Nigerian troops and Ghanaians, not always the best disciplined, but they saved lives when America wouldn't and when European countries wouldn't. They came in there and they saved lives and they forced a peace. And now there's a sense that this is our neighborhood, and that if something happens in Liberia, we in Ghana and we in Guinea and we in Mali have to worry because it may affect us. And so there's that sense of pulling together. This is further illustrated by the growth of regional organizations. You have a regional organization, economic community, if you will, in West Africa called ECOWAS. There's one in Southern Africa, there's one in Eastern Africa. There's probably one in Northern Africa too, but it's probably tied to an Arab thing in the Middle East. These economic communities are in an early stage, but they are beginning to work. There are joint projects that come together. I'm working on a project that will involve moving iron ore from Guinea through Liberia to shipment to markets. And the two countries have to work out how that's going to happen and how they're going to share power for their two countries. There are people coming from Ghana and Nigeria and going to other countries to show what they need, what they know and how they can help and invest in those countries. Very importantly, South Africa, which had for many years was run by Europeans, descendants of Europeans, because they'd been there for 300 years. And they finally ended their racial exclusion policies and oppressive policies called apartheid. In 1991, that ended. It was unsustainable. It ended with a great deal of apprehension, and many South African, particularly white South Africans, left. But most stayed, and they're there. There are tremendous problems in South Africa still, but there hasn't been widespread violence. The turnover to democratic majority rule has gone peacefully. People have reconciled and have dealt with the legacy of the past in which both sides committed atrocities. And the economy is still the biggest economic engine in Africa. And now South Africa, which had been excluded, a pariah state in the rest of the continent, is now leading the way with investments in mining and in technology in other African countries. And that's a very important development as well. But it's a development that's happening within even the poorer African countries. Interaction. They're not just looking to Europe and to America and to Asia. They're looking at one another and saying, how can we develop economic communities and build things that will be to all of our benefit. There's still concerns and problems. There's still divisions, ethnic divisions. And now we have other divisions imposed on that, English-speaking Africa and French-speaking Africa. Believe it or not, the colonial heritage has created its own divisions of Anglophone, as they call it, and Francophone Africa. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, there are some religious differences still between, especially countries that are divided more or less 50-50 between Christians and Muslims. But nevertheless, I see a positive forward path, and that's a good thing. Maybe if we were to look at all of these things and say, well, does any of it make a difference? Does any of it make a difference to Americans? I would say yes. If Americans don't grasp the importance of Africa and of peace and development in Africa, the importance of Africa for American business, the importance of Africa for American industry, the importance of Africa as a source of resources, of natural resources. You now have Nigeria, one of the largest oil producers in the world, Angola, another one. There have been recent finds in Cameroon, in Ghana. Just yesterday I heard of what's called a significant major oil find offshore Liberia. These areas are now becoming important to American and European national interests, not just in a humanitarian sense, but also because we look to those places for the natural resources that we depend on. And they are less volatile and less difficult than the Middle East, and in many instances, South America and some parts of Asia. There is now a U.S. Africa Command. It hasn't yet established a large basis in Africa, but it is there, and it is there to help African countries help themselves in the face of particularly external threats that may arise in a world filled with terrorism. All of this means that, unlike 20 years ago, I don't expect an American president to say, if there are issues in that part of the world, well, we don't have a national interest there, so let's just look the other way. I think that's changed, and that's a good thing as well. But the other is just the pure economics. The Europeans, the Japanese, the Chinese all recognize the importance of this African market. That 100 million households that by 2015 will be in existence and are buying things. It may still be relatively small in terms of international commerce, but it's growing. The African population is 1 billion today, and I'm not sure this is a good thing, but it's going to double by 2050. The median age is 20. All those people want to buy things and live as we do in this country. It's going to be a huge market, and I think that American business is beginning to look at it. 6 years ago, when I began spending most of my time in West Africa, I couldn't get an American airline flight directly from the African continent to the United States. None. Today, Even in Liberia, Delta flies 3 times a week. Ghana, both Delta and United fly essentially every day of the week to Ghana, and those planes are full. So there's a huge change there. I'll stop there with this because I want to give us time if any of you have comments, which I would welcome, and not just questions, but comments. I will say this, that I'm not an optimist who thinks that, everything's just going to go fine. I do believe that because of the factors I mentioned, things have turned around in a fundamental way. I think there are going to be challenges. I think there are going to be individual countries that slide and don't do very well. But overall, I would have to say, for the first time, probably since the heyday of independence in the mid-50s, we all have reason once again to be optimistic that Africa is beginning to find itself. That's going to have tremendous worldwide implications. And also in the United States, where we all believe we're the greatest, and African Americans are no different because they think whatever happens to African Americans speaks for what happens to black people all over the world. Well, they're going to realize that the real name of the game is on the continent of Africa. That's where the transformation is going to take place. And it can only be good for us. If it fails, it's a risk for us, not just because it puts at risk business opportunities or access to natural resources, but because if these countries fail in the end, they will become breeding grounds for the things that we worry about. The people who seek and attack our country and commit horrible acts around the world from which we can't escape. We can't build walls that will protect us from that. So we have an interest, even a selfish interest, in helping this success happen. I'll just say one more thing. When I say help this success, I don't believe for a minute in a whole lot of foreign aid. I think that private investment and assistance, helping people develop themselves is the way to go rather than simply government-to-government aid. Government-to-government aid, yes, in emergencies, in certain situations of that kind, perhaps with infrastructure, but that's it. Anyway, I will stop there, and thank you all for your patience and listening, and I hope that I gave you some food for thought. Good night.
What has happened to Charles Taylor? That's the first part of the question.
That's sort of one of my favorite subjects. Charles Taylor is in a prison in The Hague. He's undergoing trial. Actually, the trial has ended. He's awaiting the verdict of the court. And what has happened to Charles Taylor is important in two respects. The first respect is that it foretells an end to impunity, that if you commit crimes against humanity, you will be called to account. And that's the most important thing of that. I just want to say one more thing about Charles Taylor, which is that it was handled wrongly. Charles for crimes in Sierra Leone that are of dubious legality, and that it's a stretch, frankly. He should have been tried for crimes committed in Liberia, along with many other people who have been let go, again for political reasons. But nevertheless, I think he's going to spend his days in prison.
The more important part, I was in Namibia and Botswana in the last summer, and things seemed very, very good there. Can you make some comment on that?
A couple of comments. First, about Botswana, it's been one of the real success stories, and I didn't even mention HIV and those issues, which is being addressed, and declining rates in Africa is one of the health issues that's being addressed. Botswana had high rates of HIV. But again, it's a country that had been largely ethnically homogeneous and had good natural resources and, frankly, good governance. They had good leadership and had done very well with a relatively small population. So they're one of the success stories. And Namibia has proved to be another one, a little more diverse, but with a long history. It was originally a German colony. But they also have had very good leadership. Good leadership is the key. And I don't know how you grow good leadership. I'm hoping that democracy will help other places make that happen, like Namibia and like Botswana.
Now, I was going to ask two separate questions. The first is about Zimbabwe. I'd read the book When the Crocodile Swallows the Sun, about, I think it's a BBC writer whose family had grown up there, and he described how they had descended into real difficulty. How come Robert Mugabe is still allowed to take that country even further down, and what do you see happening there? And the second question will be on the Chinese influence in Africa, but the first one first, if you don't mind.
Okay. Thank you. Those are both very good questions. People have criticized the South African government, for example, for not doing more to remove Robert Mugabe. I think Mugabe has stayed in power, and I'm certainly no expert on Zimbabwe, but for a couple of reasons. And some of it is ethnically based, because people of his ethnicity, who are a very large group, tend to support him and worry about what happens when he goes. Others has to do with his cronies, particularly in the military, who worry very much about what will happen to them if he were to leave power. Third, I think there's just some general African resentment at being told by European former powers what to do. And there's a little bit of the British saying to Mugabe or to Africans, you need to move this guy. And the sense is that because he maltreated, and he did maltreat, white Zimbabwe farmers and often took their land, that the West got particularly outraged by this. And that in other countries and other places where people were mistreated by their governments, there was less outrage. I'm not saying those are necessarily true, but that's been some of the reason that Africans have sort of stayed their hand. Finally, I think the Zimbabweans in the end have to remove Mugabe, and I think they will. Well, he's 80-something years old, so nature will take its course eventually. But it is, I think there's been some constraint. You're not going to have African countries invade Zimbabwe to try to remove Mugabe. South Africa is strong enough to do that, but they won't. With regard to the Chinese, and I should have mentioned this earlier, when I talked about American business, and we are facing competition in this country from China, which wants the resources. And China's a little bit of a negative in some sense, because the Chinese want the resources and they are concerned about their own country. They've always been concerned with what they see as interference by foreigners. They do not want to appear to be interfering in African affairs. Therefore, they tend to look the other way. They will deal with whoever and say, how you handle your internal affairs is your business. I happen to prefer the U.S. model, which is we will look more favorably on those countries that are taking steps that protect human rights and democracy. Although obviously the African countries are not happy about this emphasis on gay rights. The Chinese just tend to look the other way. I think that's not helpful. By the same token, though, the Chinese are doing, there isn't an African country I've been in recently that isn't just filled with Chinese people. And that's good and bad. The good is they're building roads. I just saw the new health ministry building in Liberia that's totally built by China and turned over. They're being very generous. And African countries appreciate this, and that's a good thing. They're investing, not just in infrastructure, but in mining and all the other things. And they want the oil and they want the minerals. But the deals are not, they seem to be reasonably good. The negative of that as well, though, is that the Chinese, and actually I was reading The Economist, they thought this was a positive. The Chinese tend to come and stay. If they build a road, they bring a bunch of Chinese people in to build it. So the locals are not very happy because there's less employment. And then after the road is built, a lot of those Chinese people stay, and now they're selling ice cream on the streets, and they're competing with the locals for local business. In Ghana, there was a great scandal because the Chinese had even set up a brothel to which only Chinese people could go. And, brothels are illegal in Ghana, but the whole idea just seemed a little absurd. So you're beginning to get some resentment of Chinese because there's lots of them showing up and they're beginning to compete with the locals.
I would like to hear more about the African Union and how that is developing and what we might expect in the future. Is it heading in the direction of the European Union, for example? And in that connection also, I would like to hear about the police function of the African Union, because it seems to be taking a role in many the African countries. A second question, which is totally in a different alley, is the question about what about native religions? You talk about Muslims and Christians. Aren't there some remnants of the native religions of Africa still having some role in Africa? So those are my two questions.
Great. Thank you. First, the African Union, I think, is playing a very positive role by and large, I would say, right now, in that it is playing a peacekeeping role, particularly, for example, right now in Somalia, where African troops are taking the lead, but in other places as well. It's a good forum for discussion. I don't believe it will be the precursor to an African political union. I expect that to happen more in the regional communities, economic communities, as in West Africa, Southern Africa, and East Africa. They simply are more manageable, and they've got more things in common with one another. But I think the African Union has played a very positive role as a peacekeeper, as a forum. And really, when we talked about we will not recognize people who seize power by force, it's setting a kind of standard of morality, if you like, political and governance morality that the rest of the continent is noticing. There has been criticism of the African Union, particularly in the Libya issue, that it did not take a strong stand, that it allowed Europeans to remove Gaddafi. That did not sit well, not because people thought Gaddafi should be there after 40 years, but because of the European intervention and the relative silence of the African Union on that in that entire situation. Now, as far as the local religions, they remain very important. Many Africans continue to adhere to some traditional beliefs. More often than not, they adhere to those beliefs in combination with one of the major religions, evangelical Christianity, Catholicism, Islam. And so there's no movement that says, oh, we're going to, as part of African nationalism or nationalism in any one country, we're going to emphasize our own traditional religions. I think that over time, they will sort of gradually fade away. But they continue to be an influence in how people live and how they see the world.
Two questions, one general, one specific. What has been the impact of the Peace Corps over the last 50 years, generally, and specifically what's going on in Cameroon?
The Peace Corps, I think, has been, as far as I'm concerned, has been an outstanding. And the Peace Corps has done for the United States tremendous benefits because it's given young Americans a chance to interact at a basic level, at a village level, with people on the African continent and in different countries. So I think it's been a tremendously successful thing. I know there have been some issues and some problems, and obviously there are some risks that volunteers sometimes are exposed to. But overall, I think it's been very positive. I think African countries welcome Peace Corps volunteers. And really, there was a time when people look at amusement that these foreigners coming in, because they were used to foreigners from Europe or the United States coming in and living apart and riding air-conditioned cars. And here are these guys jumping on the local buses and living just like the people lived. And I think in the end, that really forged friendships. I'd like to say, by the way, that overall, and in most countries, my sense is that the U.S. remains an extremely popular place. People like Americans overall. That's one of the places in the world where we don't have to worry about a lot of anti-Americanism. As for specifically in Cameroon, I don't have any up-to-date information on Cameroon. I mean, I know that the president has kind of maintained a firm grip on power, doesn't appear to have any intention of giving it up. There are some tensions there between the English-speaking side and the French-speaking side, English-speaking side being a minority group in Cameroon, and of course a feeling that the president has kind of hung around too long and is beating up on the opposition. Again, slow change. It is not one of the great examples of democratic leadership. There's a fair amount of crime, but there's some oil resources and some signs of of activity and development in that country. I'm not sure if I answered your question, if you had something specific in mind about Cameroon.
Oil. You found oil. Cameroon, there's supposed to be an oil pipeline running through.
Yes, there is. Cameroon has some oil. It's not a major producer, but they do have some. And they have some dispute with Equatorial Guinea, which, by the way, is not one of the great places, a little island run by this dictator. They've just got tremendous oil resources, some of which Cameroon has disputed and Nigeria has disputed, but again, a very poor place where the dictator and his son, apparently his son lives in California, has $80 million house and 100 cars and things like that, which is all, that too will end. Cameroon doesn't fit that. They're not nearly anything like that, but they do face some difficulties there.
Just to back up a little, how many countries are there on the continent of Africa? And second question is, how many languages?
Good question. I don't think I can answer how many languages, but I'll start. I'll take a shot at it. I can probably. Well, last count there were 55 countries, and maybe with South Sudan there are 56. Countries sort of, to some extent, come and go. Some of these countries are off the continent. You've got the island of Madagascar, Malagasy Republic, which has gone through its political issues and is now trying to find its way back to democracy. You also have Mauritius and Seychelles, really prosperous little islands off the coast that have a large Indian population as well, people of Indian ancestry. Languages. Look, within Liberia there are, and these are subgroups and so forth, but people speak identifiably, and it's a country of less than 4 million people, 20 different languages. That's if you go to Nigeria, you're now talking hundreds. But in all of these countries, there are languages that dominate. And throughout the continent, there are going to be a few key international languages that predominate and are the official language or language of business. It's going to be English or French. In the north, of course, it'll be Arabic. In the east, it'll be English and Swahili, which is a kind of mix of local languages and Arabic. And in South Africa, for example, you've got a number of major tribes, the Zulus and Xhosas and so forth, but you're basically going to get along with English and Afrikaans, which is like an old variant of Dutch, and in Mozambique and Angola is going to be Portuguese. In Equatorial Guinea is going to be Spanish, just about the only country in Africa that has Spanish as the official language. So there are many, many languages, but virtually any place you go in Africa, you will get along very well with English or French. Some of the English Americans may not recognize as English, but it is English. I keep telling Americans, let's talk to people and say, I want to tell you. I said, no, these people were educated, have got master's degrees from the United States. You may not understand them very well, but they understand you very well, so be careful.
One last question.
One of the first major events of Barack Obama's presidency was when he went to Egypt and gave a major foreign policy speech. I realized the speech wasn't necessarily about Africa. It was more, Islam in the West. But I was wondering if you could comment on the reaction in Africa, across the continent, to that speech and to what he had to say.
The reaction to the speech, it's probably not the thing about Barack Obama that people in Africa, south of the Sahara, most reacted to. But I would say it was a very positive reaction because there was always a concern that the United States was too one-sided in its policies as regards Islam and the Arab world. Whether one agrees with that or not, I think that was kind of a popular perception in much of Africa, certainly in much of Africa that is Islamic now. But so yes, that was a good reaction and a very good speech as far as Africans are concerned. By and large, Barack Obama is just adored in Africa, and it's not necessarily based on his policies. George W. Bush did a tremendous amount of stuff in Africa, made a couple of trips over there, and was actually viewed quite positively, although Iraq wars and other things were not so positively viewed. Barack is just liked because he is a son of Africa. His father was an African, and I think Africans simply love to see that, as I think people in Ireland like to see, a Kennedy in the White House or whatever.